Well, hello everybody. Well, my name's Richard Benjamin and I'm the head of the International Slavery Museum. That's my day job. And I'm currently on secondment to the University of Liverpool as a visiting professor of slavery and public engagement. So thank you for your time this evening for what I hope is going to be a really interesting panel. So this is the second in a series of panels for the Barriers to Black Academia Symposium, Slavery and Colonialism and the Case for Reparative Justice. Now, it's been developed by Dr. Leona Vaughan, who's a Derby Research Fellow at the University of Liverpool, and Malik Al Nasir, who's one of our panelists, so it's great to have Malik here, of Forward Press, for the Centre of the Study of International Slavery. That's a research centre based in the University of Liverpool. And this particular panel is going to discuss the research methods and approaches within communities and the academy, which can centre Black voices in slavery research. And the actual title of the panel is Telling Our Own Story, Research Methods and Approaches within Communities and the Academy, which centre Black voices in slavery research. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. The panel is going to be anywhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours. We've got 2 hours if needed, but we might not use all of that. We'll see. You guys can submit your questions on the Q&A channel, and I will be looking at that as the panel progresses, and I will be taking those questions to the panelists in the second hour of this event. So you can send a Q&A in, a question in as you're listening to each individual or have a think and what have you. So I'll be picking them up and we'll return to it. But the main format is going to be each of the panelists, who I will formally introduce in a moment, will get about 10-15 minutes to put their position forward on this subject. And then after that, we will go into the second half. It will be recorded as well, and you'll be able to access that recording at a later date. There is a hashtag as well. The one I've got here is hashtag Black Voices, capital B, capital V, if you want to use that. So I'm going to go and introduce our first speaker, and then after that, the 10 minutes, I will then introduce the other speaker. So let's make a start. I think it makes sense for Malik Al Nasir to actually speak first, because obviously he's a co-convener of this symposium. So Malik is currently a PhD student at the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge, St. Catherine's College. Now, Malik is from a social sciences background, and having acquired his PG diploma at the University of Liverpool in applied social research, developed a pilot think tank called the Social Enterprise Research Initiative. And that was in conjunction with the Globalization and Social Exclusion Unit. Malik went on to do an MA in New Media Production at Liverpool John Moores Uni, and like I said, he's now doing his PhD in Cambridge. And that's on his own very interesting and exciting genealogical research into his family connections back through slavery, with a particular focus on British Guyana, which is always of particular interest to me because, like Malik, I have family from Guyana. So Malik's research has always been particularly of interest, and it's fascinating, and he's going to tell you about that tonight. He's also got a 2-book deal with William Collins imprint of publisher HarperCollins. So I don't think I can say any more than that. Malik, I'm going to go over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thanks to all the panelists today for joining this important symposium on barriers to Black academia, the slavery, colonialism, and the case for reparative justice. So when I first thought about the idea of doing a symposium on this, it was rooted in my own academic experience, which had been primarily a negative one. Growing up in Liverpool in the 1970s, in a place called Netherley, where there were 100,000 white families and 4 Black families, there were no Black teachers. I never encountered a Black teacher until I arrived at university. And in the entirety of that university, with some 4,000, 5,000 students, there was only one Black teacher, and she never taught me. So I never saw Black role models anywhere in the pipeline at all, from the beginnings of my education right through to university. And my education was disrupted by 9 years in local authority care, when I had a period where I was receiving virtually no education at all, which rendered me kind of semi-literate at the age of 18, and homeless after social services put me out onto the street. Unfortunately, you know, I was picked up by a mentor who took me out on the road and mentored me, a gentleman called Gil Scott Heron. And as a consequence of his mentoring through, you know, poetry and learning to become literate, I went on to college and university and to unlock my potential. But that was a potential that was entirely and utterly stifled by the lack of opportunity within the pipeline, if you like, within that system. So as a consequence of that, I had two things going on educationally. One was that I was behind everybody else. My starting point was subterranean. It was below ground. What I had to do just to get to ground level in order to make a start was just almost insurmountable. And then I had to do what everybody else was doing to progress through the pipeline, and faced innumerable barriers along the way. So I wanted to really try to create, along with Dr. Leona Vaughan, to create a kind of a framework where we could have a conversation about the experiences of Black people and the barriers that we faced throughout that. We had the first symposium last week, as Dr. Richard Benjamin has told us, and this one today is going to be focused on, you know, our methodologies and how we centre Black voices within the academy, and what's stopping us, if you like, from doing that. So I'll give you an example. When I did decide to do my own research into my own family back through slavery, I acquired an archive of documents, which were business documents of my slave owner ancestors, a firm called Sandbach Tinney. I had hundreds of folios and, you know, lots of accounts and various different things. And I was walking around all the different universities saying, look, I've got this. This is an amazing epic story. It tells the story of empire from a position we haven't seen before. Please, can you give me some funding? Can you let me in? So on and so forth. And I faced innumerable barriers to getting into the universities to do a PhD. And then once I'd even got offers of places, eventually I faced barriers in getting funding for that. And in the end, I decided to completely ignore the university system entirely and took it to the general public. And I published my preliminary findings on the BBC and got 1.5 million reads in 24 hours. And that's what precipitated the book deal. And now I've got a full scholarship at Cambridge. But I had to subvert, if you like, the pipeline in order to be able to do that. And this is the question as to why that was necessary. So during that period, when I was trying to sort of decide about doing a PhD, there was a symposium at Manchester University on the universities and their contested pasts. It went over a 2-year period, and it was rooted in the work of initially Stephen Mullen and Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who had done the research in Glasgow University and Glasgow's historic links to enslavement and the beneficial interest that Glasgow University enjoyed from that, and their idea that they felt it would be appropriate for them to spend £20 million by way of reparative justice. And as a consequence of that, a lot of other universities here started to look at their own contested pasts and their own links to enslavement and their own beneficial interests. So they brought together this symposium, and there was a whole range of academics who were presenting, Stephen Mullen along with them with his research from Glasgow, and Bristol was represented, and some US universities, and there were people there from Cambridge and so on. But one thing stood out for me at that symposium over the 2 days, and that was that every single academic that was presenting on the subject of slavery was white, every single one. There was not a single Black voice. And the word that I heard repeatedly in every single presentation was abolition, 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 abolition. And I went up to them afterwards in the Q&A and I said, how come, and this is the elephant in the room here, but how come everyone presenting on this subject is white? And how come all you want to talk about is abolition? I said, you know, I've got a whole archive of documents. I held my archive up here of what was done to my family, to my people in British Guyana through the slave trade. And I'm trying to research this and I'm trying to get funded for it, and I can't get funded. But you guys are here presenting papers, and none of you have this experience. None of you have come from this background. You may have come from the beneficiaries, but you have not come from the victims. Yet you are presenting the perspectives. Where is my voice in that thing, which is all about me? that's rendered me in the position where I need to campaign for reparative justice, and I have no say in it. It's like having a trial where there's a victim, but the victim can't speak, and no one will represent them. And the people who profess to speak on their behalf are the beneficiaries of the perpetrators. And that's no disrespect to the people who were presenting. They were sincere in what they were doing, but it's a perspective that they have based upon their own paradigm from which they come from. And they're coming from it from an academic point of view. I'm coming from it from point of view of, I'm in this situation because of this chain of events that's happened. I'm a victim of this. So therefore, I have a perspective too. So I needed to think of what methodological approach I could use to try and have a voice within that. So I looked initially at genealogy, and genealogy is not generally classed as a kind of a methodological approach, but I wanted to bring it in because it gave me two things. It gave me, one, the ability to be able to manage all the various different narratives that were going on within this mercantile dynasty that was enslaving people and spanning shipping and banking and politics and a whole range of other, mercantile pursuits. But two, what it also did for me personally was give me the ability to actually retrace the steps back through history of what happened to me and how I got to be in the position I am today. But moving forward from that, what beneficial interest they got. And when I found that members of the family included Prime Minister Gladstone, members of the family included the founder of the Bank of Liverpool, who became Barclays Bank, members of the family became the founders of Caledonian Insurance, which became AXA Insurance. You know, when I started to find that these people were the beneficiaries, they still enjoy beneficial interest to this day. One of them was Antoinette Sandbach. At the time when I pitched my PhD, she was a sitting member of Parliament. So when we consider the case for reparative justice, you look at it in legal terms, you imagine, A, is there a cause of action? Something was done to someone. There was a perpetrator, there was a victim. B, is there a causal link between the thing that happened to the person and the outcome? You know, are we in the condition that we are today because of the thing that happened to us historically through slavery? And then C, is there liability on anyone for that? So if there's people still enjoying the beneficial interest of that, surely they should bear some liability for that. And then finally, it comes down to quantum. You know, what's the value of that liability? And that is the kind of thing that I'm trying to work on through my research now, to try and demonstrate the direct causal link, the absolute, you know, not anecdotal, but the specific beneficiaries, so that we can make a case for reparative justice. And there are many ways in which that might manifest itself. And I'm not going to profess to have the final model for reparations. You know, there are a lot of different people who are going to speak in these panels: Esther Stanford-Cozy, Hilary Beckles, and other people who are deep in that realm. So I wouldn't profess to speak for them. But what I would like to see is some sort of a quasi-judicial body emerge from this to be able to adjudicate, if you like, all of the victim nations or the victim peoples, and all of the perpetrators. And for me, that forum would be the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Malik, for that. It's a really interesting way to start, and there's some really fascinating threads that I think we're going to cover later on. So thank you for that. So our second speaker this evening from the US, so thank you for joining us, is Naya Bates. Now, Naya is a doctoral student in the history department at Princeton University in Princeton, New Jersey. Her current research interests include US slavery and Reconstruction, Black radicalism, memory and historical interpretation, and Black rural cultural preservation in the United States South. She has a Bachelor of Arts in African and African American Studies and an MA in Architectural History and Historic Preservation, both from the University of Virginia. Now, for the past 5 years, Naya has worked in public history and served as the Director of African American History and the Getting Word African American Oral History Project at Monticello. Now, she is featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Oprah's Book Club, that's a big one, Netflix's High on the Hog, Monty Don's American Gardens, excellent program, and more. So without further ado, over to you, Naya. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. And thank you all for attending. I do want to acknowledge that we are having this panel while people on the ground at the University of Liverpool are still advocating for their rights as laborers and as employees. So I just want to take that moment to acknowledge that we're holding this program while they're still fighting for their own equality. So a little bit of background on how I came to this work. I was taking a course at the University of Virginia as an undergrad called Art and Culture of the Slave South. And in the class, we were studying the material culture of slavery, looking at plantation landscapes, understanding the built environment associated with plantations in the American South, and also acknowledging the craft and the skill of enslaved craftsmen who built those spaces, but also created things for themselves. And so as part of that course, we were traveling around to plantations in Central Virginia, outside of the city of Charlottesville. And one of the plantations that we visited was called Clover Fields. Now, my family is from Charlottesville, Virginia. Charlottesville, Virginia is my hometown. We've been in that area. My family has been in that area for 5 to 7 generations in some places. And so the reality for me is that the history of slavery is not all that distant from the lived reality that I am living in. I drive past places where my enslaved ancestors labored. I see the products of their work on a daily basis. But I hadn't at that time, as an undergraduate student, really considered the power of those narratives and what it would mean to more fully address the history of slavery in our physical landscapes. And so at this time, as an undergraduate student, we visited a plantation and we were given a tour by a descendant of the original owners of that plantation. And we started by looking at all of the places outside, the burial ground for enslaved laborers. We looked at a corn crib, a dairy, a smokehouse, just looking at all of those physical workspaces within this plantation landscape. And the last thing that we saw was the main house of this plantation. And we entered that space through the basement. In the basement, there was a kitchen, a washroom, and some other things, but the first space that we entered was the kitchen. And the woman giving us our tour, the descendant of the original owner, reached behind our group to close the door. And hanging on the back of that door was a collage of photographs of African Americans who had worked at that plantation in the years after slavery. And right in the middle of that photograph was a picture of one of my oldest aunts, dressed in her uniform, working in the kitchen of this plantation. It was a photograph I had never seen, and no one in my family had ever spoken about our direct connection to these spaces beyond working there in freedom. So no one ever said to me, "You have enslaved ancestors who were enslaved at Clover Fields." But it was that field trip that really sparked my interest in studying the landscapes of enslavement in Virginia. So for the past 6 years, I've worked at Monticello, which is the home of Thomas Jefferson. It is the only American house museum that is listed as a World Heritage Site, a designation that it shares jointly with the University of Virginia, which was also founded by Thomas Jefferson. And we are given that honorific status because of the character of the architecture, because of Thomas Jefferson's significance as a founding father, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and all of these colonial achievements that are celebrated and deemed as worthy of World Heritage. But what is not included in that nomination is the history and culture of the hundreds of enslaved people who made that history possible. And so my work for the past 5 years has been to really grapple with that. What does it mean for us to consider reparations if we have not also reckoned with the duality of our past, if we haven't really grappled with why we celebrate someone like Thomas Jefferson, but don't also really significantly grapple with his legacy as a slaveholder, but also his expressed visions of racial hierarchy and white supremacy. And so that has been my work for the past 5 years. That work has involved confronting biographies of Thomas Jefferson written long before anyone considered the oral history of enslaved people worthy of study. And so through the Getting Word African American Oral History Project, we are saying to the world that descendants of enslaved families have as much claim to the history at Monticello as anyone else, that they are as much authors of that history as anyone else. And even if the documentary archive related to those enslaved people is minimal, if those documents only reveal their first names, their types of labor that they did and where they may have lived on the plantation, that there is still value in learning from these communities. And so through the Oral History Project, we have been able to collect oral histories from just over 225 direct descendants of people who were enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. We take their oral histories and we combine it with other documentary research that we are doing. So we have our formal archives, and we also have the work of our archaeology team to recover that material history, to get into the ground and really read things that were last deposited by the enslaved community. And we also have all of our work to put those things in conversation with what the experiences of enslaved people were on other sites of enslavement. So at Monticello, we have the Getting Word Oral History Project, but we also have the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which is run by our archaeology department and now incorporates sites throughout the Americas, including Jamaica, St. Kitts, Nevis, and the US South. So that allows us to really fill in some of those holes in the experience of the enslaved community. So with those interviews, we've collected the interviews and we started sharing them with the public as early as 1993. They have informed our public tours and interpretation of slavery by filling in those gaps of what it was like, that embodied experience for the enslaved community. It has helped us identify surnames of the enslaved families at Monticello, and it has really changed the way that we interpret the legacies of slavery by providing us direct and concrete opportunities to talk about the legacies of enslavement for these specific families who lived and worked at Monticello and were owned by Thomas Jefferson. So that work has been celebrated in all the spaces that you heard mentioned earlier. That work has been, featured on the Today Show. It's been featured on The Guardian. It's been featured in all these documentaries. But that's really a testament to the genius and the achievement of these descendant communities. And so as we think through questions of repair, and in America, that conversation is really focused on responding to more capitalist goals, right? More demands for hard cash as reparations. What does it mean to reframe that in terms of restoring and repairing the history attributed to these communities? How do we return descendants to the landscapes where their ancestors were enslaved so that they know who they are and where they came from? How do we begin to fracture some of the disconnection that happened as a result of sale and separation for enslaved families? Through the Getting Word Project, we've been able to reconnect different branches of families who were enslaved at Monticello and sold away or given away as gifts or mortgaged. Whatever reason their family was separated, we've been able to reconnect branches of the families with each other, 5 and 6 generations removed from slavery. And so there is this idea that we can look at reparations more holistically to incorporate this material and cultural history. And so I think I'll stop there, and I thank you all for joining.
Fantastic. Thank you, Naya. Some really interesting work there. And again, we'll definitely follow up on some of that. So thank you. Right, so our next speaker, we have Nasra Elliot. Now, Nasra holds a sociology degree from the University of Westminster, and she is an active citizen for the British Council and, of course, of community activists who we know well in Liverpool. Now, Nasra is a director and member of the Liverpool Black History Research Group and the director of the Return Project, a youth empowerment programme for African diaspora young people who live in Liverpool. Now, reading topics from the Black radical tradition, and Nasra has an interest in Black cooperative economic thought, Liverpool's role in slavery, Liverpool's Black presence, the ramifications of slavery and colonialism, and how these legacies impact our reality. Nasra, thank you for coming, and over to you.
Thanks, Richard. So my name is Nasra Elliot, and I basically had my degree in sociology. However, during my degree, I learned a lot. I read scholars that I'd never heard of before, and I basically scattered all my essays, my dissertations with Black scholarship. That was a crucial and turning point for me. I'd always read from a young age, and one of the most impactful books I read I was approximately 12 years of age, was Sex and Race by J.A. Rogers. And that really opened my eyes and, gave me the enthusiasm to understand, how the world works and why it works and why Black people are treated the way that they are. So after university, I've done various work, but I'm now in politics. But as a member of the Liverpool Black History Research Group, we actually only began in February 2019, but it's a grassroots community project. I'm a volunteer. I don't do research via work. It is purely voluntary, but we've already made an impact within Liverpool and wider Liverpool and excited people's interest in the subject. We wish to engage, a broad audience, and also for them to understand that this is our history. We've done interpretive plaque scheme, which means Liverpool City Council are going to put up schemes for Eric Lynch, in the name of Eric Lynch, who was a historian from Liverpool. We've also got the Bark Hill Project, which is to save and campaign to save a mansion house that was for that was actually inhabited by slave traders. We've also done a database which basically gives a large amount of the money acquired for Liverpool University came from the money of, slave traders, people with plantations, and the slave economy. So we've achieved quite a bit in our short time. And because Liverpool has the oldest and continuous Black community, I'm driven because we haven't progressed in this city as Black people in the way that we should. So it's great that we've been here for, X amount of years, up to 300 years plus, 10 generations or more deep. But to actually see that in practice, we haven't achieved a lot. A lot of our native sons and daughters have to go away to actually excel. So the academic activism is what I call it. What we do is to try and, uncover the history of Liverpool in terms of the enslavement period and how that's affecting us now presently. And what we, in simple form, want to do is say to the institutions that have benefited that, it's pretty simple. It's imminent that you start engaging with us, the Black community. It's imminent that you need to start employing Black researchers, and that we are beneficiaries of, what they have taken from us. It's not difficult to engage with the Black community. It's not difficult to share your resources. It's not difficult to employ people. So that's the position that I've come with today. I'm not sure, I don't want to go too much into it because I want to obviously do the debate and discuss. But I just find it quite draining that we're still having to have these conversations and to explain why we need to be at the forefront of it throughout the entire process, from planning to the end. And we need to be, valued. And the fact that we are the subject, we are not asking for anything at all. We're just asking to be treated humanely and with respect that everybody else has. And, the fact that the University of Liverpool is digging its heels on, reparative justice and reparative justice schemes is deplorable, because the University of Glasgow and, obviously, Naya will know, and Stephen over in the US, I'm sure there's, fantastic schemes and work going on over there. So Liverpool really needs to catch up, because Liverpool was predominant in the enslavement of Africans. We were made off that. It's well documented. So the fact that Liverpool University is, delaying processes and not including grassroots groups like ourselves. Liverpool Black History Research Group is not the only Liverpool-based researchers. You know, they should be including us. They should have included us a long time ago. And the time is now. We've requested freedom of information from them. We've wrote letters to them, and we're yet to get, you know, included in the way that we should be. So that's just my little 2 pence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nasra. Very thought-provoking. And again, there's some issues there that will be, I'm absolutely sure, come up. So thank you very much for that. So our next speaker is Michael Ohajuru, who is the Senior Fellow of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Now, Michael blogs, writes and speaks regularly on the Black presence in Renaissance Europe, and he's spoken at many, many facilities and museums such as the National Gallery, Tate Britain, the British Library, National Archives, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now, Michael's the founder of Image of the Black in London Galleries, a series of gallery tours. He's the project director and chief evangelist, he's got here, of the John Blank Project, an art and archive project celebrating John Blank, the Black trumpeter to the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII. And he's co-convener of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, What's Happening in Black British History series, which is a series of workshops. I think there's been several of those in Liverpool, so you'll be well known, Michael, around these parts. And he's also a founding member of the Black Presence and British Portraiture Network. Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Richard, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think this is a really exciting time to be involved in Black things, Black studies, and Blackness in society in Europe. But it's also a challenging time. And let me say it's changed a lot from when I was coming up. Black history, essentially, well, Black people didn't come to Britain until 1944, and there's no history before then. And if there was a little bit, it was slavery. That was back in the day. It's changed so much now. Changed so much. There's so many new ways into it. And hopefully I've been part of that. That we see that Black history is not just like Black people as victims, you know, and white people savior. You know, to your point, Malik, about abolitionists, the white savior mentality. You know, we're beyond that now, and there's so many exciting ways we can look at that. We'll look at that, and some of the initiatives I'm part of, we do that. I'll share a couple with you. Like, for instance, my John Blank project celebrates John Blank, the first person of Black African descent who have an image and a record of. He was Henry VIII's trumpeter. And people, many white people, Black people, are shocked to find there was a Black people in Tudor times. Well, you know, you have to say, calm down. We've always been here. And that opening sentence to Peter Fry's book, there were Black Africans in Britain before the English. You know, it's so true. It's so true. But it gets on a lot of people's nerves. And that's why, you know, I talk about these are exciting times. It's also challenging because there's always a backlash, literally a backlash. I just found one this morning, in fact, a site called History Reclaimed. Let me explain. There's a number of initiatives I'm involved with. I mentioned the John Blank Project. There was I do my image of the Black in London galleries, where I take people around galleries and I show them the Black presence in the art on show. And again, people are shocked to find that there are Black people in 16th, 17th, 18th century art. They're there. They have a presence. It's never been explained, articulated. But I have the pleasure of introducing people to many of these works for the first time. They've never noticed them, although they've looked at these pictures many times. There's also the one that was mentioned earlier by Richard, what's happening in Black British history. This is my most important initiative, what I'm part of my most important initiative. This is where we bring together the streets, what I call the street. These are academic. These are ordinary people, local community historians, a bit like Nasra, you're just talking about this Liverpool Black History group. We're doing history locally on the ground, and we bring them together with academics. We have them in universities, so you can have a professor on the same platform as a housewife discussing Black history, because it's in the universities, and some ways it gets a bit too rarefied and often a bit too, Malik, to your point, a bit too white, where we give a Black presence, and it's when you've got skin in the game. when you're involved in it, you're a bit more passionate. You're looking for a bit more. You want to know a bit more. And what's exciting about what's happening in Black British history, we challenge people to look at a history beyond colonialism, beyond enslavement, beyond immigration, in terms of the Black contribution to a British society, to European society, the things that are not only associated with Black people, rather than, because it's always the Black as victim, slavery and all that nonsense. We've moved on from that now, and there are many, not just great stories, great histories, but relevant to us today, and that's what we do in what's happening in Black British history. And it's important to pick up on your point, Malik, about history is not just one of it's just a Black history, not just one of enslavement. It's much richer, and it's coming with a different eye, and that's why these are exciting times. We can come with different questions, and these questions we can get answers from our point of view, from a Black perspective. It's not just a white owner. And what's really, I keep using this word exciting, I think is exciting, this idea of I can now talk about white privilege, white supremacy, and not feel uncomfortable with my white friends, because they know this is very, the narrative has been twisted, been side, revealing the narrative, the fact that I'm anti-slavery history, because we've got enough slavery histories. We want a history from the point of view of from Black people's different perspectives. I'll finish on this point. There's an exhibition in The Hague right now, which is on slavery, but it's taking the view of 12 people involved in it. And it shows you how complex it is. It's not just about the Black guy in chains or the Black woman in chains. It's a much more complex, a much more integrated economically, socially, culturally, and bringing that together. And because the Venn diagram that we have as Black and white people, we need to recognize it and build on it, rather than say, this is Black history, this is white history. It's what one of my Czech friends talks about, a together history. And that's what I'm about, having the eyes to look at that and understand it and be open to it. I know I sound a bit polemic and a bit kind of ranty, but it's something that I really care about. The history is not just Black history or white history. It's that bringing understanding how and where we come together across the world in so many ways. We're not separate, we're one. It's not, there's not the unanimous many, out of many we are one. That kind of, I know it sounds nonsense, but really it's true, and it's looking at our history from that point of view. And I'll finish on that, Richard, that sense of looking for the commonality, the ground, how we together can make the world a better place to understanding each other better.
Thank you so much, Michael. And don't apologize for that enthusiasm, because I tell you what, that's what draws people in. And if people aren't enthused by listening and speaking to people like yourself, then things aren't going to change. So thank you very much for that. Now, last but not least, we have Professor Stephen Small. And Stephen's going to be showing a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll introduce him first. So Stephen is a professor in the Department of African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And Stephen is the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. He earned his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and that was in 1989. He researches the history and sociology of Black people across the African diaspora, including the Americas and Western Europe. He's held visiting positions at universities in the UK, the Netherlands, France, Spain, Brazil, Japan, and Zimbabwe. And he's currently writing a book on slavery, imperialism, and their legacies in Black Liverpool. Stephen was born and raised in Liverpool, and I'm sure he's going to tell you a bit about that. So Stephen, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. Can you see the PowerPoint okay?
We can indeed, yes, looks great.
Okay, thanks a lot, Richard. Thanks to Leona and to Malik for the invitation. Thanks to Richard for the introduction and to the other panelists. I've been energized hearing these experiences, which in many regards are very similar to mine in terms of Nasra and Michael and Malik, and also in terms of Naya, given that I've done a lot of research on representations of slavery in these heritage sites. So thank you for the invitation. Okay. All of my education in Britain was a colonized education. I was born and raised and earned my bachelor's and my master's degree in Britain. Okay, you see there the schools I went to, and overall I can simplify the experience of British education as one in which all the white people were good, civilized, and superior, or the Africans were bad, savage, and inferior. In other words, for me, British education was a grand, multifaceted misrepresentation of history. And it was almost entirely hallucinatory, with the British scholars and politicians imagining things that were simply not there. So British education tried to colonize my mind, and my mind was saved by family and by local Black and some non-Black community members, like Sandra Antigua, like Jimmy Rogers, Cookie Ambrosius, and so on. And so I continue to decolonize my mind with the help of family and community and other people. Today's panel is called Barriers in Black Academia. Okay, barriers to Black knowledge in British universities. So what are these barriers? They are simple: limited knowledge production and teaching by and about Black people, as Nasra and Malik have outlined, a monolithic and non-diverse staff at all levels in British schools and universities, education which is largely developed to achieve national self-praise and glorification, a refusal or failure to recognize the overwhelming evidence of institutional racism at present and in the past, an inclination widespread to point the finger to explain the obstacles that confront Black people, to point the finger at everything except racism. In other words, British education is still not a fully objective, impartial, and multifaceted process of knowledge creation and transmission. So where do we start? I identify 4 areas. In curricula, evaluate the assumptions and the foundations upon which a curricula are built, and bring in the voices of Black women and men, scholars, educators, analysts, people with experience. Problem number 2, staffing. We need to increase the diversity of educators. Bring in the voices of Black women and men. Third issue, how to increase access, particularly for students, also for lecturers. And again, we need to bring in the voices of Black women and men. It's really straightforward. Men and women who are experienced, knowledgeable, and as Michael suggested, passionate and engaged. And number 4, resources, particularly fellowships, childcare, recognizing the obstacles that Black women particularly face. And again, bring in the voices of Black women and men. When I give talks these days in England, in the US, people ask me, what should we do? I have a simple answer. Talk to Black women and men in organizations, in groups, individuals. We've been working on these issues for decades, for generations, and for centuries. So talk to Black people, but make sure you pay them, or us. I want to be paid too, because our knowledge should not be given for free. Okay. We cannot wait for British education to transform itself fundamentally. We should not wait for the system to change. Black women and men have never done that. And I think the examples from Nasra reveal how important that is. So we need to identify, create, and expand our own writings, our own research, our own knowledge production. And I argue that there are 3 types of writing outside British education. Oppositional writings, which refuse to accept some of the multifaceted nonsense, the misrepresentations, the global assertions of British goodness without any evidence whatsoever. And here you see some examples. And Nasra mentioned Eric Lynch, who has been one of the main stalwarts and defenders of Black perspectives, but there are others. So oppositional writings. There are also independent writings, biographies, memoirs, speeches, interviews, material in archives and social media. Vast amounts of information written by Black women, but not in mainstream books, because knowledge produced by Black women and men is not valued mainly in mainstream books. We have exceptions. I have books. Malik has books. Other people too. Okay. So independent writings. And lots of this is now available on social media. Third, collaborations between academics and non-academics, building alliances, drawing on personal experiences, family experiences, community experiences. And I think that what Nasra has described with the Liverpool Black History Group is an attempt to build an alliance, although the university is not being responsive. Clearly, we know from experiences with Richard that the museum is there to build an alliance. And people continue to describe me as an academic, as if that's the only dimension of my attitude. And you know what I say these days? Listen, I am an academic, that's my job, but I was Black a long time before I became an academic. So let's not forget that, okay? What are the next steps given these problems? My friend Barna Hesse, Liverpool-born Black, his father was Ludwig Hesse. He said, listen, Stephen, we can't start everywhere, so we have to start somewhere. So where do we start? Well, I argue there's no national solution in Britain to the national problem. London is not Leicester, Leicester is not Liverpool, Liverpool is not Leeds. So we need to look at the local context. Who are the people? What are the relationships? We need to look at resources and information that's available. And we need to establish priorities and opportunities. By the way, Black people are doing all of this already. I'm simply summarizing what I think is going on and suggesting what I think is the best way forward. And the very fact that Leona and Malik have organized this, I think, is an example of how to center Black voices, which I think is the phrase that Malik used. Michael is right. There are very significant changes in British society. When I did my master's degree in 1981, there were 3 books, if that, on the history of Black people. We didn't have Peter Fryer's book. Now there are 50 or more books. There are hundreds of articles. There is a lot of material by Black people, about Black people, and by non-Black people. It's not as much as we deserve, but it's far more than we used to have. So identify the resources that are immediately available. A lot of groundwork has already been done. Many partners and allies exist. And we know what to do. The issue is how to get it done, given the obstacles confronting Black women and men, the inequality, the direct and indirect racism. So the issue is we know what to do, how to get it done. Okay. Single most important step, I believe, is to draw on Black knowledge, Black experience, Black insights. I think Malik and others, and Nasra and Naya have made this clear. We need to identify Black voices from the past, as with this seminar, in schools and departments and administrators. We need to identify Black voices from the present, Black voices from the past. And what I've come to conclude is that overwhelmingly in Britain, there are demands to address legacies of slavery. And increasingly over the last 5 years, having spent 30 years of my life studying slavery, I've now become preoccupied, very preoccupied with imperialism and looking at Black voices in imperialism. And the difference between slavery and imperialism, all of them, both of them were designed by the British to exploit, to dominate, and to subordinate. However, Black people were able to generate far more knowledge, far more writing, far more speeches, far more information. And at the risk of exaggeration, almost all of it is diametrically opposed to everything that British scholars have told us about the good, decent, civilizing mission of Gladstone and Chamberlain and Alfred Jones and Elder Dempster. We know about all of them. And identify Black voices in Liverpool. Ernest Mark, Pastor Eckhart, Ludwig Hesse, all of these people, we knew none of them. They told us nothing about them in British schools when we were younger. We have to push them to do that, okay? What are the immediate concrete goals in Liverpool? I'm sure that Nasra would agree. Liverpool really needs to respond and engage with the Liverpool Black History Research Group. Their findings on enslavement and enabling education. It is really a travesty that the University of Liverpool, with all its resources, has waited until a group of Black people in the community working voluntarily have produced this overwhelming evidence. I know the University of Liverpool knows about it. I'm on a group that's involved in renaming panels, and I really encourage the university to move dramatically and rapidly rather than defensively in rectifying and repairing this damage. The university has renamed Gladstone Hall after Dorothy Kuya, and it's about time too, okay? They're planning an event. We can work with the International Slavery Museum on Dorothy's papers. Let's keep this ball rolling. And the university and the museum, which has far more resources, should do that. There's also information and knowledge from Black people that's been put together by Madeline and her co-director and others at Writing on the Wall. There are other local Black writers, including several people here. And then Jimmy Jagney and myself are working on a number of articles to recognize 20th century Black voices in Liverpool. I know I'm a bit longer than I expected, but give me one more minute. Okay. There are lessons from the USA. I am in the USA. People always ask me, it should be race and gender. Sorry for the spelling, I'll change that. Okay. The first thing I say to people in Britain is Black people in Britain can never have what Black people in the US have. Why? Because Black Britain has 2 million people and the US has 44 million Black people. Okay. Black people in the US do not have as much as they deserve, even though there are 44 million, but they have far more than we will ever have in Britain because of these numbers. The US also, I believe, is not representative of the Black experience across the Americas. There are more Black people in Brazil that speak Portuguese than in the United States. And I believe we can get more insights from the Caribbean and Brazil, in particular, because our experiences in Europe and Britain are shaped overwhelmingly by European imperialism in ways that have not directly impacted Black America. However, there are tremendous practical insights, knowledge, curriculum, writers inside and outside US education, conferences, seminars, organizations, groups, you get the idea. All of this substantive, concrete information. In addition, we can get inspiration, motivation, encouragement, creativity, vision, determination, and endurance. People my age know that in Britain in the 60s, we had no Black writers. Our minds were saved from colonization by reading Angela Davis, by reading Stokely Carmichael, by reading June Jordan eventually, by reading Black Power, Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleavage. So we can continue to borrow from the USA, okay? That's my final message. Thanks for listening. Michael, you've reminded me that maybe it's because I've got skin in the game that I'm still so passionate. I don't know where I get the energy from, but it's a long fight. We've come a long way. There's a long way to go. And I also want to finally say that the presentation by Sir Hilary Beckles, I think, made concrete some of the outrageous direct racism of the British educational system. Its treatment of Eric Williams, its treatment of Arthur, his name slips me, but Arthur Lewis. We know in Liverpool about Fletcher and Fleming, etc., etc. Okay, so let me stop there, and I look forward to some further discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that.
And I'd just like to acknowledge, first of all, Dr. Leona Vaughan. Without Dr. Leona Vaughan's input, this symposium would not be happening. When I first approached the university with the symposium, the initial answer was no, or we'd love to help, but we've got no money. Dr. Leona Vaughan stepped in and said, I've got a budget, I will fund it, let's do this. Then obviously we got Hilary Beckles and some other people, and thankfully the university relented and decided to fund this symposium. So I'm grateful to the university for doing so. But also, Dr. Leona Vaughan's now in the States and she was unable to be here today. But, she has been the principal driver behind this whole entire project. And I'd like to thank all the panelists here today for giving up their time and, for embracing this conversation. I think it's a conversation that needed to be had. And I'm really glad that we've had such a good turnout. And we're recording this, and just to remind everybody that there's one more panel that's going to be happening next week, and after that panel in March we're going to be having a round table, and we'll also be producing a report which we hope to be able to discuss at the round table and to make some policy suggestions for universities, academic institutions, and research councils and funding bodies. So all of the information that's been discussed here today, the previous panel and the next panel, will all form part of that discussion at the round table. So all of your input will be very greatly received and also processed as part of that. So I would like to end this by just saying thank you to everybody for your input, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next one next week. Okay, thank you all. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.